Being given only one lecture to cover the philosophy of Hegel is a very difficult task. It's so huge, so comprehensive, so exhausting as simply to follow Hegel's lines of reasoning and to plow your way through Hegel's books makes it a kind of a difficult project. Woody Allen once said that he had gone to a speed reading class and he learned how to read War and Peace in 45 minutes. And when he was finished, he said it was about Russia. I have some of the same feelings about teaching you Hegel in the next 44 minutes. You're going to find that it's about the world. It's about history. It's about everything. And all philosophies are about everything, if they're any good at all, so it's not especially illuminating to find out that it's about the world, it's about what is, and stuff like that. So let me take as my point of departure the idea of spirit, in German Geist. It's central to Hegel's philosophy. It's central to his conception of reasoning, to his conception of history, to the big topics in Hegel's thinking. Now, Geist is translated in English as spirit. It's the part of the world, the part of that which isn't nature, which isn't matter, or isn't exclusively matter, isn't exclusively physical. It's the part of the world that isn't the tables and chairs, the animals and plants, simple, brute matter. Geist is exactly everything that isn't nature. Geist is mind, spirit, reason. And it'd be worthwhile to consider the origins of the word Geist. It comes from German roots, and it has the same roots as two words that are in contemporary English. One is gist, as in the gist of an argument, the kind of logical center, the logical marrow of a series of thoughts. So somehow the essence, the logical essence of something, the gist of an argument, is connected to Hegel's idea of Geist, built into the idea. And a second word that we have in contemporary English, which is derived from the same root as the German word Geist, is geyser. The kind of natural phenomenon they have in Yellowstone Park. Every hour or so, Old Faithful, the geyser, shoots water under pressure out of the ground on a more or less regular schedule. The idea of a geyser, the idea of a natural upwelling, is also implied in Hegel's idea of Geist. And the combination of logical essence or essentiality, logical, marrow of an argument, in this case the logical marrow of human existence, of human being, the plan of all of human life, is what he's driving at with the idea of a Geist. Geist is spirit. Geist is soul. Geist is mind. But Geist, as Hegel uses it, does not specifically refer to the individual minds or psyches that you and I might have. I mean, that's part of it, but it's a great deal more than that. And in order to understand what more it could mean or what its significance is, we have to drop back a little bit to my lecture on Kant. I finished up Kant by talking about Kant's political philosophy. The reason I did that is because I wanted to discuss briefly the idea of subjectivity, the idea of personality, the idea of being an ego. And Kant thinks, and this is very important for understanding Hegel, because he's in some respects the next generation of German idealism after Kant. Kant thinks that personality, that subjectivity, is not just a quality of this person and this person and this person. There are other subjects, other rational, free, moral agents that are not people. For example, God, the angels, or in the case of Kant, nations. Nations of free, rational, moral agents. That's why the categorical imperative applies to them. I'll trust you on that. The categorical imperative does apply to all free rational agents. And Kant sees nations as being such rational agents. In other words, his idea of subjectivity, of personality, is not limited to the meat that individual human beings are. Hegel is going to take this idea of a collective subject, this idea of a personality that inheres in things larger and more complex than individual human beings. But he's going to go beyond Kant's idea that individual nations are rational, free, moral agents, that they have moral personality and moral responsibility. And instead, he's going to view the entire human species as being one enormous collective subject. So in other words, the whole species of human beings, from the very beginning of human history and human existence, form a life history which is like the life history of an individual human being. It is analogous to that. What this means is that the phases of human history are analogized, and I think more than analogized, actually identified with the phases of development in an individual human being. So the human species comes into existence in a kind of infancy, ignorance, superstition, and an inadequate understanding of its own qualities, of its own capacities, and of its own potentials. In other words, primitive human beings didn't understand the nature of the entire human project, of all of human existence, for the same reason that 5- and 6-year-olds don't understand what it's like to be an adult, because they lack the appropriate experience and they lack the appropriate development and knowledge that comes from experiencing the world. Hegel holds the view that all human beings taken together on a global, universal scale, and this emphasis on the global, the universal, is very much a part of German idealism. You hear resonances of Kant in many parts of Hegel. Hegel thinks that all human beings form one giant collective subject, and that means that we can go back and look at the actual phases of human history as the kind of life story of this giant subject. And he thinks that it is possible not only to look back on these phases of development, but actually discern the process of maturation, the process of development, the process by which this giant subject, this ultimate subject, realizes the potentials that were in it from the very beginning. In some way, this is a kind of, it's an analogy, but it has a certain plausibility to it. There is something buried deep within children that allows them to eventually become scientists or mathematicians or whatever. They have some sort of potential for logical analysis, for the comprehensive articulation of their experiences, and they also have the ability to learn from their experiences what they are and what the world around them is. And that, according to Hegel, is what the career of all of human history amounts to. So we could say, when you stop and think about it, that Geist is the soul of all of humanity. It's the soul of the human race. It's the part of all of human beings which is not material, which is intellectual, which is rational, which is somehow metaphysical. Okay, so he is a metaphysical thinker, very much in the German tradition, but in addition to that, he's going for much bigger game. He is trying to do what may well be impossible. He's certainly the last philosopher to attempt this project. The project that Hegel has is to present a comprehensive interpretation of human existence. It's an attempt to say, this is what human beings are, this is what their whole career amounts to, and by implication, he hopes to kind of plot the trajectory of human history and of human life, and find out also where human existence is going. He honestly thinks and seriously believes that it is possible to discern the ultimate goal of human existence. He believes that it is possible to rationally find out what the goal of humanity is, what the point of human existence is. And he's certainly the last of the great philosophers to attempt such an perhaps impossible task. Now, we found when we studied Kant that in some respects, Kantian moral theory is a way of taking the biblical moral theories, the idea that we ought to do unto others as we would have them do unto us, of taking the golden rule, of taking essentially Christian ethics, and putting it in a kind of formulation which allows it to be intellectually respectable in the age of idealistic philosophical systems. In other words, Kant takes Christian morality and provides a justification for it which is independent of Scripture, but which is viewed as being essentially complementary to Scripture. There's no conflict between Scripture properly understood through right reason and the results that we get when we apply reasoning to questions like the categorical imperative, the questions of universal morality and universal ethical judgment. Well, Hegel is going to do something analogous. Hegel wishes to take not Christian ethics, but Christian eschatology, the idea that there will be an end of the world that the end of the world is part of God's universal plan for all human beings, and essentially dip it into the vocabulary and into the patterns of thought characteristic of German idealism. So where Kant takes Christian morals and gives it a logical foundation, a logical connection to the trends of Enlightenment thought, what Hegel does is take the idea of an end of the world, of a millennial change in the human condition, where there'll be a reconciliation between God and man. Those of you who are familiar with the New Testament will know that the book of Revelation, the last book of the New Testament, details the end of the world. God is going to cash in everybody's chips at some point and say, enough is enough. Finally, I'm going to end this progress from the earliest condition of human beings in the Garden of Eden, or moving up the ladder of evolution, or wherever they stem from. And he is actually going to finish this project. What it means is a couple of things. First of all, there exists a God who has a providential plan for all of human beings. What's the phrase? Not a sparrow falls, but not God knows about it. Well, there's something like that built into the Hegelian philosophy of history. Hegel believes that he can seriously tell us what the ultimate purpose of human history is. He can tell us what the whole goal of all of human existence is and what all of human history drives towards. Now that's a big intellectual project. I think most people would hold that he was unsuccessful in doing that. I think that's a fairly reasonable assessment. But in part, it's just the grandeur and the enormous aspiration of this attempt, which at least immediately should involve our attention. Now what Hegel wants to do is go back and look at all the history he can have access to, and that's not very much. Even though Germany put together a very remarkable historical culture in the 19th century, the amount of actual historical data that Hegel has to work with is not very good, not very accurate, not very comprehensive, and thus his history itself suffers from certain defects with regard to that. But he does think that he sees the broad general outlines in the progress of human beings. Progress is central to Hegel's conception of history, and his conception of history is central to his conception of philosophy. What he adds to the rationalism and idealism of the German Enlightenment is the idea of history. He has freedom and rationality existing in space and time. He brings down the world of metaphysics, in other words, and puts it here in the realm of physics. It's not that there aren't two worlds, a metaphysical and a physical realm, it's just they seem to beautifully overlap. There's a sort of pantheism in Hegel, which you also see in Tolstoy, for those of you who know Tolstoy's novels, where there's a vast kind of oceanic feeling that you get, and you come away with the feeling, if you read War and Peace, that God is really running everything and that we're all just atoms in this vast flux, this vast pattern, put together according to some rules that we ourselves are incapable of completely discerning. Well, Hegel kind of holds that view, except that he believes that he is completely able to discern these, which is, again, perhaps the vanity of the philosopher, but give him credit just for the project that he attempts. Now, when we're dealing with Hegel's philosophy of history, what we're going to be dealing with is the Geist, the human soul, the human spirit. How did it get to be the way that it is? And how is it that we can account for the fact that the Geist used to be different? That human self-consciousness, that human society, that human culture, all of which are expressions of the Geist, incidentally, that it develops and that it changes. How is it that something perfect, ultimately rational, ultimately real, with a capital R, the German philosophers are famous for capitalizing their nouns to make them abstractions. It doesn't actually happen in the German language. All German nouns get capitalized, but in order to get the sense of how they're using words in unusual and unfamiliar ways, we usually capitalize Hegelian rationality, Geist, and things like that. Well, this special use of the Geist demands, in a way, that we inquire how the Geist could have come to have the properties that it does, and how it is that it's changed over time, and are there laws by which we can describe and then implicitly predict the future development of human history. And Hegel thinks that we can. According to Hegel's understanding of human history and human spirit, each time, each epoch, each historical moment has its own Geist, has its own level of maturity. And each great historical epoch makes a contribution to the development of this overall human spirit. It's something analogous to, I don't know if you know Ralph Waldo Emerson, the idea of an oversoul. right, that connects us all? Well, the oversoul has been developing over time. Emerson was a great fan of German idealism. And the Geist, the spirit, has been developing over time, and it hasn't been developing in a haphazard fashion. It's been developing according to its own necessary laws. And these laws are the laws of rationality and freedom. One thing you'll want to note when you study German philosophy, particularly German idealism, is that all the German metaphysicians, Kant as well as Hegel, connect the idea of freedom and rationality. Freedom and rationality are always closely bound up. Now, the Geist is the essence of human existence. It's the part of human beings that isn't meat, that isn't the corpse that we carry around with us. It's our spirit, our soul. And each historical epoch has a different spirit or soul, and that spirit is expressed in the characteristic cultural productions of that time. Now, this is not so far-fetched. Most of us can see some sort of connection between the Renaissance humanism of, say, Machiavelli's political theory and the development of, say, Renaissance humanism in the arts. For example, the development of perspective in visual art is something we don't see in the visual art of the Middle Ages. Well, this emphasis on humanism is something that carries over into the various products of the Renaissance, and you can see a consistent sort of spirit of the times in the characteristic cultural products. Think of the Enlightenment. The typical philosophers of the Enlightenment are the German rationalists or the French rationalists and the English empiricists. Both of these have a kind of scientific orientation to the world that brings them into line with the developments in physical science that are being made in roughly the same time. And then if we look at the art that's characteristic of the Enlightenment, if you know the Bach's Brandenburg concertos, it's like walking into a giant clockwork. We're walking into the Newtonian universe when we hear the Brandenburgs. So the idea of a spirit of the time, however nebulous and amorphous, has a certain plausibility to those of us who can kind of make these kind of broad generalizations. And up to a point, you see it or you don't, but I think most persons can get a sense that common intellectual concerns, common intellectual questions interact with each other and influence each other in the same concrete historical moments. So we have these abstract ideas of moving our intellectual orientation, say, from God to nature, which is characteristic of the Enlightenment. Well, you can see those concerns not just in physical science, but also in political science, in moral theory, and also in visual art, in music, in all the cultural products. And the cultural products of our society are the expressions of its spirit. We often, in kind of everyday terms, talk about things that are consistent with the spirit of the times and inconsistent, that seem out of step with the times. Well, what we're really saying there is that it doesn't seem consistent with the general trend of the culture and its orientation. It's not so far-fetched. Hegel takes it a long way, but this is basically what he's talking about. Now, the idea of a spirit of the times means that there's one spirit that all of these kind of coalesce into. And what that is the universal mind of humanity, the soul of humanity. And it turns out that the soul of humanity, that the spirit, is becoming progressively more knowledgeable, both about the world around it and about itself. As spirit, which is the kind of general, collective, universal human soul, becomes more conscious of itself, it becomes more conscious of its essential characteristics. And the essential characteristics of spirit are that it's not nature. In other words, that it's free and that it has the potential for autonomous rationality. Again, this harks back to Kant's conception of the distinction between nature and mind, or phenomena and noumena. Well, Hegel is going to connect these over, have phenomena and noumena in some respects overlap, but hold on to certain metaphysical tinges here. In other words, he wants to have it all. He wants an entirely this-worldly, historically comprehensive treatment of human existence, and he wants to have God, freedom, spirit, rationality with a capital R, continental sense of the term. So he wants it all. Now, spirit, in developing its consciousness, in becoming more conscious of itself, learns essentially modern Newtonian physics. It learns how to push nature around, which is what physics is. You apply it to your physical knowledge of the world, and what you get is technology, the ability to push nature in ways that satisfy you. The other thing that spirit learns is about itself, and what it learns is that it's free, that it's rational, and that it's somehow separate from nature. Now, it's a commonplace of Enlightenment thought, goes back at least as far as Descartes, that knowledge is power. And what that means is that since our knowledge, both of the world around us and of ourselves, has increased throughout history, has been a progressive addition of new elements of knowledge to the human spirit, by implication, we have also increased the amount of power that we have, because knowledge is power, and progressively increasing knowledge means progressively increasing power. Now, we have to ask ourselves, what happens when we calculate out the trajectory of this, to use a sort of Newtonian image? When we figure out, more or less graphically, where this gradual increase of knowledge and power goes, what it goes is to the absolute completion of all of knowledge and all of power. Where else would it go if you stop and think about it? If we can continue this on more or less forever, because although individual human beings die, the species seems to go on without much of a chance of dying, well then add the idea of not just temporality, but eternal temporality to this process. What does that mean? It means that human beings are progressing in self-consciousness, which means that they are progressing in their knowledge of themselves and the things around them, which means that they are gradually increasing their knowledge, which means that they are gradually increasing their power, and the final limit, the final end, the ultimate purpose of human existence is the finishing of this project of increasing our knowledge and our power. Now there's a being that's all knowledgeable and all powerful. You may have heard of him. It's God. Now when I said earlier that what Hegel's philosophy is Christian Chiliasm, or Christian millennialism, or Christian eschatology, the end of the world, the unification of God and man, God's final ultimate judgment on human existence. Well, what Hegel has done is taken that idea and said that he has rationally discerned the ultimate pattern of all of human existence. All of human culture, all the products of the human mind and spirit gradually allow us to climb the ladder of self-consciousness. And when we complete the product of self-consciousness, we have completed the purpose of spirit. Hegel says, makes a beautiful line in the Philosophy of History, that the owl of Minerva only flies at dusk. Now, we'll add the owl of Minerva to our philosophical bestiary. We'll have Plato's philosophical dogs. We'll have a whole bunch of them there. Hegel's particular contribution to our philosophical zoo, the owl of Minerva, is the idea that we really only understand things in hindsight, that you're really only able to comprehend what's going on after you've done it, and you can retrospect about it and think about it. You look, for example, at the events of your own life. You go back and read your own diary, or you look at your own photographs from your Sweet 16 party, and you say, if only I knew then what I knew now, or what I know now. Then I was at one particular point in my development, and I was doing the best I could, but now I've moved on beyond that, and I can see what was coming now. I understand much better now than I did then what was really going on. Well, Hegel thinks that that's true right across the board for all of human history. And that means that we all participate in the Geist, and we all move the Geist further. We all manage to add to this general, global, universal progress of the human spirit when we connect with the spirit of the times and push it a little bit further. You can hear also the echoes of the sort of ruthlessness that's characteristic of all rationalistic thought. Push it further could be thought of as the motto of the ruthless rationalistic thinker. And Hegel pushes it about as far as it's going. He's told you all what your purpose is. And he's told everybody what their purpose is to the end of time. That's quite a project. You don't see that very often. It is, in fact, a kind of mythology, but it's a profound sort of mythology, and one that deserves our close consideration and respect. Now, let's take it a little bit further. Let's consider the characteristic on-the-job difficulties of the philosopher of history. And perhaps Vico is the first of them, but Hegel is the one who really brings it together. Hegel not only thinks that he's telling you about the Geist, Hegel thinks he is the Geist. What else could he think? The Geist has coalesced. It has consolidated itself on his writing table. He is not writing the Geist's history. He is writing the Geist's autobiography, because he's the first guy at the time, at the very tail end of the Enlightenment, to say, I finally figured out what the Enlightenment means. It means that human beings as a species collectively finally understand what they really are. And what they really, and capital R really here, what they really are is Geist in the world of space and time, gradually realizing its own potential. Aristotle has an idea of entelechy. What entelechy means is natural purpose. That somehow inside every acorn is a natural purpose to become an oak tree. You may not see it there, but it's hidden there. And if you give it the right conditions, those potentials are realized. What Hegel thinks is true about human beings is that they have buried within them on the species level an entelechy, that back at the time of the Greeks or even before were a kind of acorn that contains with it in the entirety of human self-consciousness. In other words, all roads lead to Hegel's writing desk. All of history leads up to the point where we finally understand what we are. And he's the one who did it. So he is the Geist for a moment. And he is essentially ending human history. In other words, history ends when we finally reconcile ourselves with the divine mind, when we finally understand what we really are, when we finally come to the culmination of the development of freedom and rationality. And it finally happens when human beings as a species become conscious of their own entelechy. And that is what Hegel thinks he has done. In other words, he has capped off the entire history of human existence. Makes you want to stop and take a breath. So it's somewhat, in other words, I wasn't being entirely facetious when I said at the beginning of the lecture that it's like reading War and Peace in 45 minutes and saying it's about Russia. Hegel's philosophy is about everything. It's about what it means, it's about where it's going, it's about what its intrinsic properties are, it's about how you connect to it, it's about nature, it's about spirit, it's about mind, it's about rationality, it's about freedom. It accounts for all of human doings. It accounts for the rest of human development as well. Hegel has been an enormously influential thinker. Those who objected to the metaphysical, essentially Kantian elements in Hegel, give it a new twist later on in the career of philosophy. They adopt a materialistic naturalism, which tries to discern the progressive laws of history based upon a one-world, naturalistic ontological orientation. This is called Marxism. Right? Marxism, in that respect, is an extension of the Hegelian project of discerning what the ultimate laws of historical development are. The difference between Marxism and Hegelianism is this. Hegel thinks that there are no laws of history in the sense of causative laws which makes one thing happen in a determinate way after another. Those are the laws of nature. The laws of history are not the laws of causal determination. Again, here's a Kantian difference. We're splitting the world into phenomena and noumena. The laws of history are the laws of freedom, the laws of rationality. Human beings do not do the things they do because they have to in a determinate, causal, physical, necessary way. They do it because that's their nature, that's their potential. There is something free and rational in human existence, in human society, that is begging to get out. And over time, as human beings come to know what they are, as they come to know what their intrinsic purpose is, they become more divine, they become freer, they become more rational, and they're climbing the ladder of progress. We finish this when we finally understand that this is what the human condition is. That we are essentially not just spirits in a material world, but we are part of a giant spirit, which is the only thing in existence that is not nature. You can see kind of Tolstoyan elements here. Those of you who are familiar with War and Peace, especially the second epilogue of War and Peace, the idea essentially that was articulated by Emerson, we lie in the lap of an immense intelligence. Well, we not only lie in the lap of an immense intelligence, we are a part of that immense intelligence. We reconcile God and man when we finally realize the potential that human beings have buried within them by nature. And realizing this potential is coming to our own self-consciousness. And we finally come to our own self-consciousness only when we understand the career of spirit in human history. It's a remarkable intellectual achievement. I think, to be honest, it is more poetic than it is logically satisfactory. general totalizing discourses have gone out of fashion in a skeptical age. And certainly one of the difficulties with it is that it is essentially Christian theology. It is essentially the idea that that the ultimate purpose of human existence is the reconciliation of God and man. It is that thought given a new logical form. So it has been very influential, and the difficulty that people have repeatedly had with it is that it seems too closely associated with mythology. The attempts to create a naturalistic approach to human progress and human history will wait the middle of the 19th century. Marx will attempt to do it, and in some respects, all of the evolutionary naturalism that we find in the philosophy of the 19th century is a part of this Hegelian attempt to bring into philosophical consideration history and the process of human development. What Hegel shows us is a big turning point in the history of Western philosophy. And the turning point comes from the fact that we have changed our orientation. Back in the time of Aquinas in the Middle Ages, our primary concern was with God. All real intellectuals spent most of their time thinking about theology and trying to organize their thinking about God. Theology is foundational as an intellectual project for the thinkers of the Middle Ages. After the Middle Ages kind of wane, I mean, the Summa Theologica is here. There's not a lot more we can do with that. If Thomas Aquinas doesn't want to take it any further, I don't see anybody that really wants to finish off the book. So instead of continuing God as our central intellectual focus, what's characteristic of the Renaissance, and particularly characteristic of the Enlightenment, is an increasing movement in our focus from God to man, or in the case of the Enlightenment, from God to nature. Nature is the big target of the Enlightenment. Nature in terms of our physical theory, nature in terms of our moral theory, nature in terms of our political theory. That's why social contractarianism and the state of nature are big parts of Enlightenment political thought. Hegel represents a new twist to that. Instead of having nature be his fundamental intellectual concern, his foundational problem, for Hegel and for many of his devotees, and also for the people that criticize him, for his critics in the 19th century, their primary concern will not so much be with nature as it will be with history. All of the great intellectual, or most of the great intellectual movements of the 19th century were concerned with articulating some sort of architectonic plan to human history. We've done a pretty good job with nature. By the time we've wrapped up Newtonian mechanics, there are still things to do. We can add Maxwell's equations and things like that in the 19th century. But for the most part, the big concern of the 19th century is not tidying up physics. They've done a pretty good job with that. The big concern is history. So utopian socialists, guys like Comte and Fourier, are people who are interested essentially in ending history. They said, look, the previous centuries, the previous societies, the previous governments, and the way they've treated human beings has been a scandal, has been a disgrace. We have now gotten to an enlightened state of consciousness where we can put together a new society, where we can abolish that earlier history and have true human relations and a truly human world. Marx's philosophy is shot through with that idea, that the Industrial Revolution makes possible a new epoch in human history, which is fundamentally different from all the other phases in human history. In some respects, although Hegel is not a widely cited philosopher today, and even though very few people would describe themselves as practicing Hegelians, he is the most important thinker of the 19th century because he throws into play the big intellectual ball of the 19th century, the problem of history. Even in some respects, Darwin, with his naturalistic orientation, will be concerned with not just connecting human beings to nature, but with also explaining human history from a naturalistic point of view, adding the idea of time, of temporality to our logical categories. That's what Hegel does, and that's what makes Hegel so important. In that respect, he is the scientific thinker, or the philosopher of the 19th century. He's the last person to actually try and tell us what the meaning of history is, to explain what the whole significance of human life, what the purpose of human existence is. And if he fails at that, he's still significant because of his later intellectual influence. We now are 5 or maybe 6 generations separated from Hegel, and still, every one of those generations since Hegel has been concerned with the end of the world, essentially, with the end of human history. And here I don't mean end in the sense of the end of my lecture or the end of the movie. I mean the end in the sense of the purpose. And once we achieve this purpose, once we realize this purpose, then we can turn the corner and live the life of true felicity. We can totally change the world. It seems to me, for example, that Marxism and all of utopian socialism is an attempt to do this. It seems to me that most of the reforms of the late 19th century, things like social Darwinism, are also attempts to fundamentally change our conception of human history and to bring into being a new, more rational, and in that respect, more free society. To fundamentally change history, or to change society because the earlier history is different from what we have now. Think of the apocalyptic elements in things like Woodrow Wilson's War to End Wars. It's the millennium. And Woodrow Wilson was more than aware of the German philosophical tradition. He himself is an intellectual idealist. The war to end wars, the First World War for that generation, they thought of it as essentially a secular apocalypse. And this connects back into the millennial elements, the chiliastic elements in Hegelian philosophy of history, and it also connects back to the idea that us now have finally broken free of the earlier constraints. We're the first new generation. The problem is that the first new generation has been around now for 5, maybe 6 generations, ever since Hegel. As a matter of fact, every generation since Hegel has been ending history. They did it in the 19th century. They did it in the beginning of the 20th century. Think of something like Daniel Bell's End of Ideology in the 1950s at the end of the First World War. It's the end of history. I would also say that modern intellectual trends and practices are, with varying degrees of comprehension, the heirs to Hegel's end of history argument. For example, the idea of the slippage of the text, the idea of the breakup of not just objectivity but of subjectivity, the idea that we can no longer articulate our views and we can no longer argue or articulate thought in quite the way we had before because of the slippage of the text, the uncertainty of translation, because of the messiness and contingency of human life. What I think that amounts to in thinkers of the 1980s and 90s, and I bring this in because somebody in one of my lectures last weekend talked about deconstructionism and talked about, what was the other, Derrida, I believe it was. It seems to me that all of these arguments are essentially disguised end-of-history arguments, that something fundamentally different and new and important is happening to us right now that makes us totally different from all the other generations who have been stuck and enchained to the earlier traditions of Western philosophy. The problem is that this is nothing new. We've been doing this ever since Hegel. And in that respect, all of these end-of-history, or these crypto end-of-history arguments are in fact homage to Hegel. Homage to the idea that not only, or that even if human history can no longer be viewed as a necessary progression towards an ideal state, towards a final state of human existence, there is something fundamentally different about us which allows us to recognize that fact. Well, the idea that we fundamentally turned a corner with us sounds like it's real new and really exciting, and it thrills undergraduates when you tell them stuff like that. My point is that it is probably at least 150 years old. And when you stop and consider that, it takes a lot of the sting and I think a lot of the force out of the rumors that Western philosophy and the Western intellectual tradition has declined on account of the decentering of speech and things like that. In fact, we've been decentering things, we've been ending the world, we've been turning the corner, we've been starting something totally new for a century and a half now. And that most of the people who think that they are breaking this new ground are actually traveling well-worn paths and changing the vocabulary with which they articulate that. And not only that, but most of them don't recognize that fact, and if you pointed out, or if you told them that most of this is implicitly Hegelian, they would laugh at you and say that you don't understand, and I suspect that this is a misapprehension, not just characteristic of our own culture, not just characteristic of our own time. Ever since Hegel gave us the idea that history had a meaning, and that all of human existence has some cohesion to it, everyone has felt that they were in a privileged position of knowing that they were somehow at the end of this. It has to do, as I said with Hegel earlier, with the occupational hazards of being a philosopher of history. Every philosopher of history cannot help but believe that the history of philosophy leads up to them thinking about the history of philosophy. What else would it lead up to? it leads right up to here and now, and what I'm doing here and now is thinking about the history of philosophy and also the philosophy of history, and it turns out to be me. And so we must forgive Hegel his perhaps megalomania, the idea that he had finally broken through the cosmic egg, that he had cut the Gordian knot, that he had finished solving the ultimate mystery of human existence. It has to do with something, with a sort of myopia, with a sort of intellectual distortion that is introduced into thinking about the history of philosophy and the philosophy of history, of temporalizing the development of rationality. When you temporalize and turn the history of philosophy into a series of phases, the last phase has to be you. And the last phase has been us for about 150 years now. I have no doubt that in the next century, again, here's charting out that Hegelian trajectory, there's going to be a whole new generation of philosophers that want to get tenure that are going to have to get rid of this earlier generation and really turn the corner and have a new, totally changed end of history. It could be that we'll never get beyond Hegel in that respect, that we all feel the need to create a novelty that is spurious but entertaining. And that is our homage to Hegel, I would say. So, even if it is a little presumptuous to explain the true reconciliation of God and man, even if it's just a tad implausible to write the Geist's autobiography, to actually be the Geist, all of our intellectual concerns and all of the intellectual concerns since the time of Hegel have been one way or another dealing with his legacy, either by accepting it and trying to reformulate it in such a way as it's consistent with the dominant intellectual trends of the time, and what could be more Hegelian than that, or rejecting it and saying that we've totally changed the corner, we have to throw out all this Hegelian stuff. And what could be more Hegelian than that? Either way, they're stuck with Hegel, and for all the limitations, for all the poetry, for all the kind of metaphysical lapses in it, it's the last great attempt to articulate the meaning and the significance of all of human existence. He tells us that we are all one, not just in the flesh, because we're not all one in the flesh, we come and go, but we are all one in the spirit. It's the final kind of apotheosis of Christian theology, which is dressed up in the clothing of enlightened political and social and historical theory. And for that reason, Hegel is perhaps the last and perhaps the greatest of the synthesizers of the tradition of Athens and Jerusalem. You may never guess it by reading in because it looks like more technical, dry German philosophy. What it really is a poetic attempt to explain to everybody what it all means. It's what people think philosophers do for a living. Well, the last one that actually tried to do that for a living was Hegel, and for better or worse, we're living with his legacy and probably will never get beyond it. Homage to Hegel.